Hello and welcome to Business Standard. Here's a glimpse of the views expressed on the web pages of Business Standard this week. In his weekly column National Interest, Shekhar Gupta writes that the second wave of COVID-19 is Narendra Modi's biggest crisis yet. It's bigger than any security threat or even the recession of 2020. The crisis with the return of COVID, already twice as bad as the peak in the first wave and worsening still, has the potential of unraveling the Modi government. It is true that people dropped their guard, resumed partying, held big weddings and so on. But what signal were they getting from leaders? That festivals, the Kumbh Mela and election campaigns could go on now because the war against the virus was over. The way out for the Modi government is simple: get more vaccines into people's arms. For a population our size and our raging infections, our pace of 3 million a day is too slow, Gupta writes. In his weekly column for the Business Standard, TN Nainen writes that with coronavirus cases rising in the country, it was time the government got rid of the event management mindset and got cracking. He writes that much is at stake and the government needs to focus on real solutions and not make a mockery of the crisis through vaccine festivals that produce a drop in the rate of vaccination. Nainen notes that instances of the event management mindset, like banging utensils from balconies, switching off lights, and burning candles for 9 minutes at 9 pm, showering flower petals on hospitals from hovering helicopters do not help. He also writes that instead of leaving the containment of infections at mass events like the Kumbh Mela and election rallies to the gods, the government needs to get serious. In his weekly column for the Business Standard, Mahesh Vyas writes, a tragedy seems to be unfolding again. As COVID infections have risen and vaccines have run into shortages, governments have started announcing selective lockdowns and are talking of greater lockdowns as well. So sections of labor have once again started getting anxious about the security of their livelihoods. Although science has delivered vaccines, the informally employed labor seems almost as vulnerable to loss of livelihood as it was a year ago. The difference, if any, is a much reduced fear of the virus and therefore a significant dropping of guard against it. But the fear of loss of livelihood is as real as before. If a sudden lockdown was a bad idea a year ago, the prolonged indecisiveness on action combined with vaccine shortages isn't a much better place to be in, writes Vyas. As COVID rages, as hospitals are overwhelmed, as people die, the worst thing you can do is announce an utsav of any kind, Veer Sanghvi writes in a column for Business Standard. You need first of all to figure out how we messed it all up so badly. You need to fix accountability, you need to sack the guys who messed up. None of that is happening. Instead, the government is encouraging super spreader events like election rallies and the Kumbh Mela. Its ministers are playing politics, playing opposition states for the problems with the vaccination drive. As for the key questions, why are vaccines running out? Why is oxygen in short supply? Why are these proven failures still in charge? We get no answers, Sanghvi writes. 6 internet-led firms recently turned unicorn in quick succession, writes Nivedita Mukherjee in a column for Business Standard. There were celebrations all around. The message was that India's finally arrived on the scene where a $1 billion valuation for a privately held startup was not a once-in-a-blue-moon phenomenon anymore. But while becoming a unicorn is surely a marker for a company in its growth story, it's not a turning point of any significant worth. The reason is there's nothing real about a startup valuation. It's a notional value depending on the cash flow availability, ambition, and assessment of the key investors backing that company. Since its valuation has nothing to do with revenue, profits, or any other benchmarks used in any traditional business, it's something of a sentiment-driven play by investors, Mukherjee writes. Naushad Forbes writes in a column that our immediate challenge in handling the COVID crisis is ramping up the capacity to address the surge in cases. This means hospitals rededicated to COVID and supplies of oxygen and the necessary drugs. The second immediate task is to end all gatherings of more than half a dozen people now. Now means now, it does not mean after the West Bengal election and the Kumbh Mela. It's an absurdly dangerous act of irresponsibility to allow hundreds of thousands of maskless people to gather in one place. Forbes says the fact that this is a mistake that is bipartisan only makes it doubly irresponsible. In a column, Neelkant Mishra discusses drivers that are helping businesses across multiple sectors. He says many businesses would not have grown without the rise in teledensity, data use, and smartphone penetration. Another driver is improvement in rural roads that has helped a large part of the population to connect economically through efficient movement of labor and goods. Similarly, electrification helped expand the workday, automation of unpaid work in the household through appliances, and is also helping expand the cold chain. In payments, India skipped the cards-based payment system and leapfrogged to the more efficient digital system UPI. Mishra says improvement in basic infrastructure and systems being built layer upon layer have now brought us to a point where there is reason for optimism in business. Business Standard writes in an editorial that the government's decision to open the door to vaccines made in the US, UK, and other foreign countries is a welcome move. Till now, the authorities had insisted that even vaccines that had passed large phase 3 trials elsewhere in the world must conduct additional bridging trials in India. This caused major delays. It also was costly, so pharmaceutical companies that were not expecting to make great margins on their vaccines in India did not attempt to get regulatory approval. This was a short-sighted approach, as the need was to get as many vaccines available to the Indian public as possible in order to avoid another wave of the pandemic, the editorial says. A fresh controversy over the 2015 Rafale fighter jet deal urgently demands a solid explanation from the government, Business Standard writes in an editorial. This time, the revelations from a French anti-corruption agency claim that commissions worth over 500,000 euros were paid to an Indian middleman in a government-to-government contract. The reluctance to subject the Rafale deal to open scrutiny at a time the same government's enforcement machinery is rightly subjecting Mamata Banerjee and Maharashtra's Mahavikas Aghadi to investigation speaks of double standards, the editorial says. A rapid surge in COVID infections has increased risks to economic recovery, Business Standard writes in an editorial. India is now reporting over 200,000 daily COVID cases. Various state governments are imposing restrictions to curb the spread of the virus. Maharashtra has stopped most activities except those marked as essential. This is bound to affect overall demand and supply. If the number of new cases doesn't start coming down quickly, other states may also contemplate similar measures. Things could get worse if restrictions are extended in the coming weeks and months. But it's worth noting that despite the fresh restrictions which will affect demand, the year-on-year numbers on economic activity will look good from here because of a lower base. Policymakers should not get deceived by such numbers, the editorial says. Private fundraising is estimated to have exceeded public transactions in every single year over the last decade, writes Business Standard in an editorial. The flow of private equity or venture capital funding is bridging the crucial risk capital gap in India, which has allowed some of the firms to grow rapidly. It's also the biggest source of foreign direct investment. Savings in India are not sufficient to fund the investment needs of the economy. Besides, the allocation of household financial savings towards equity is negligible. Many of the new businesses would not have grown the way they have without the support of foreign risk capital. So it's important for policymakers to constantly assess the business environment and improve the ease of doing business, the editorial says.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.